In the early days of the Second World War, living in some parts of London must have been a truly terrifying ordeal. The relentless nightly bombing that began in September 1940 as Germany launched the Blitz and mainly targeted the docklands around the East End, saw around 100,000 civilians either killed or seriously injured and over 1 million homes and properties destroyed by the time the raid subsided in May 1941. Despite the daily threat to life, many Londoners soon built up a fatalistic outlook to the bombing, believing that if their time was going to be up, there was little they could do about it, and they may as well, as the popular saying went, keep calm and carry on, living the best they could in the difficult circumstances. The bombing, blackout and disruption to everyday life also gave normally law-abiding folk opportunities to risk things they maybe wouldn't dare in normal circumstances, fearful of the consequences. Although heavily frowned upon and with the threat of dire penalties, the temptation from looting from bomb-damaged shops and houses remained ever present. Buying and selling black market goods and petrol wasn't seen by many as proper law-breaking, and with food bought with ration cards, keeping a bit under the counter for certain customers to buy was unpopular but generally accepted. But although petty crime was quite commonplace during the blackout, it also created opportunities for more serious criminals. Larceny and theft from warehouses and locked premises was much easier, and it gave killers the chance to flee from their crime scenes undetected in the almost total darkness. This is a story of one man who tried to use the carnage and devastation of the blackout and the Blitz to cover up his brutal crime and evade justice. It's Friday, the 17th of July 1942, and the nightly German bombings have ceased. Having abandoned his attempt to invade the British mainland, Hitler has turned his attention on Russia, and this day sees the start of the Battle of Stalingrad. In London, the summer heat was making conditions uncomfortable for workmen demolishing the burnt-out and derelict Vauxhall Baptist Chapel near Kennington. Badly damaged during the Blitz, the wall and floor had collapsed, and now it was felt safe to work without the threat of daily bombs. Workmen set out clearing up the rubble as the gradual rebuild of bombed-out London began. One of the men working in the cellar in front of an old fireplace lifted a large slab of stone with his pickaxe. As he flipped the stone over, he saw that it had exposed what appeared to be human remains. When he slid his shovel underneath the skeleton, the head fell away, and believing it was either a victim of an air raid or perhaps, considering the location, the result of a previous church burial, he put the bones to one side, informed his superiors and continued his work. At the end of the shift, the police were notified and 2 detectives examined the remains and had them taken to nearby Southwark mortuary. Despite the sheer volume of casualties caused by the air raids and bombings since the outbreak of the war, each body discovered had to be reported to the coroner and a post-mortem or autopsy carried out. On the following morning, pathologist Dr. Keith Simpson, in the mortuary to carry out a routine post-mortem, was asked if he would take a look at the remains that the detectives had brought in on the previous day. It was meant to be a simple formality of declaring that death had been caused by enemy action, the details logged, and the case closed. Simpson asked the location of the discovery, and 2 pointers immediately suggested to him that things were not as they may have first appeared. From bits of tissue clinging to the bone, he was immediately able to age the skeleton as less than 2 years old, ruling out a previous burial at the chapel, and from what appeared to have been a precise dismembering of the arms and legs from the torso, it suggested that this was not caused by any air raid. Believing there was more to this, Simpson got permission off the coroner to remove the bones back to his laboratory at Guy's Hospital, where, fitting around his other daily duties, he began a painstaking examination of the body. There had been numerous raids in the area during the Blitz, but records of casualties and persons missing in air raids hadn't left anyone unaccounted for in that area. Once the skeleton had been cleaned up, Simpson noticed the remains of a dried up womb, which showed that it was a female, and closer examination showed that the victim had been suffering from a fibroid growth on her uterus. His suspicion of foul play seemed to be justified. In an obvious attempt to disguise its identity, the skull had been completely severed and flesh carved from the face, and the lower jaw was missing. The arms and legs had been severed below the elbows and knees, and what remained showed signs of being burned. More significantly, after inspecting the throat, Dr. Simpson discovered that one of the tiny bones to the side of the thyroid cartridge had been broken. This suggested the victim had been strangled, and with Simpson intimating that this may be a potential murder case, Superintendent Bill Rawlings of Scotland Yard's murder squad briefed Detective Inspectors Fred Hatton and Joe Keeling to look into the case. Together with Dr. Simpson, the detectives visited the site where the body had been found, but despite 2 days of digging and sifting through several tons of earth, there was no further sign of any missing parts of the skeleton. This supported the theory that the body had been brought to the site for burial and had almost certainly been killed elsewhere, further ruling out any thought she had died in an air raid. Simpson also noticed that the ground had a distinct yellowing where the skeleton had been discovered. This was found to have been caused by slaked or builder's lime, and it was to lead to the killer's downfall. Unlike quicklime, often used in burial to hasten decomposition, slaked lime has the opposite effect and actually helps to preserve the remains by killing off bugs and insects that may have destroyed the body. Slaked lime or calcium hydroxide has a number of uses. Builders use it in mortar, farmers to help neutralise the acid in soil, and it is also used in things like sugar manufacture and water treatment. Its chemical properties in this case had preserved the voice box and would eventually lead to the murderer making the 9 o'clock walk to the scaffold. So who was the woman found to have been strangled and dismembered before being concealed beneath a stone slab in the bombed-out chapel? Simpson was able to compare one of the bones on the skeleton using the Pearson's formula and deduced she would have been slightly over 5 foot tall. There was a small amount of hair still attached to the skull, brown in colour but greying, and from examining the palate sutures on the skull, it suggested her age was somewhere between 40 and 50 years old. A check of missing persons soon turned up a likely candidate. 47-year-old Rachel Dobkin had been reported missing earlier in the previous year by her sister, Polly Dubinsky. Polly said that on April the 11th, Good Friday 1941, Rachel had met with her sister and told her she had arranged to meet her estranged husband, Harry Dobkin, later that afternoon in Dalston. Rachel was hoping to collect some maintenance arrears. That was the last time Polly saw her. She failed to return home for supper that evening, and on the following afternoon her disappearance was reported to the police. Rachel Dobkin's handbag was later found in a Guildford post office containing her ration book and identity card. In wartime London, both items were essential, and for them not to be missed, there was no evidence the loss had been reported. It suggested she would have no further need for them. An investigation was launched, but it was to be 5 days before detectives spoke to Harry Dobkin, and in the meantime a strange incident occurred at his place of work. In the early hours of Monday the 14th of April, a policeman noticed smoke coming from the cellar at the rear of the chapel at 302 Kennington Road. The fire brigade was summoned and the blaze quickly extinguished. Dobkin stood by watching as the fire was put out and gave no satisfactory explanation as to why he, the fire watcher, had not called the fire brigade. There had been no bombs or incendiaries dropped during the night, which suggested the fire must have been started deliberately. Later that morning, Reverend Harry Burgess came to the premises to survey the damage and noticed there was straw scattered on the cellar floor. He went away, and when he returned later that afternoon, it had been swept up. He relayed his suspicions to the police and noted in his diary that he believed the fire had been a case of arson. Detectives interviewed Dobkin regarding his missing wife, and he told them they had met up as arranged at a cafe on Kingsland Road, Shoreditch. They had discussed the maintenance payments, and he promised to try to keep up to date with them. He said they had a cup of tea together, and he walked her to the bus stop where she caught a bus home. He said he then went off and bought a pair of trousers from the store. A cheque found that Dobkin had made regular payments for the last few weeks and had purchased the clothes he said he had. Police made a second visit to the premises and noticed that a shallow pit had been dug in the cellar. Although it seemed a bit suspicious, there was no evidence of any foul play. On the following day, there was a major incident a few streets away with over 20 people killed and dozens more seriously injured when an enemy plane dropped a landmine. With police forces undermanned and officers overworked, a missing person inquiry was low on their priorities, and after a brief investigation, a report was filed and it was pretty much forgotten about. Although whoever had buried the skeleton had made a thorough attempt at concealing its identity, they had left enough clues for skilled pathologist Keith Simpson to work with. The lower jaw was missing, but what remained of the upper jaw had enough information that if her dentist could be found, it would help to enable a positive identification. Polly Dubinsky helped officers to trace her sister's dentist, Bernard Copkin, to a North London surgery. He confirmed Rachel Dobkin was his patient, and detectives later noted that his records were among the most detailed they had ever seen. Referring to his notes, he was able to draw a sketch of her upper jaw, which he signed and dated. On the following afternoon, the dentist visited Simpson's laboratory at Guy's Hospital, where he was able to immediately confirm the remains were those of his former patient, excitingly declaring, "This is Mrs. Dobkin's upper jaw, and those are my fillings." Simpson then copied a technique that had been used 6 years earlier in the case of Indian doctor Buck Ruxton. Ruxton had murdered his wife and housemaid before scattering their dismembered body parts in a ravine in Scotland. Professors Brash and Glaister had Mrs. Ruxton's skull superimposed onto her photograph, and this helped bring the killer to justice. Mirroring the Ruxton case, Simpson had a picture of Rachel Dobkin placed over her skull, and it was found to be a perfect fit. Satisfied that the victim was Mrs. Dobkin, Detective Inspectors Keeling and Hatton looked back at the case notes made in April 1941 and into the background of her estranged husband. Harry Dobkin was born in London on the 15th of August 1893. After leaving school, he worked in the clothing trade and had married Rachel Dubinsky in September 1920. In Jewish tradition, the union was arranged by a wedding broker, but so ill-suited were the couple that their marriage lasted just a matter of days. However, in that brief time, a child was conceived and a son born in the following year. Rachel Dobkin then applied for and was granted maintenance costs, and Dobkin made these payments so sporadically that he found himself in the dock at Old Street Police Court on a number of occasions. He had even served 2 terms in prison for non-payment. Following the outbreak of the war, Dobkin had found work as a fire watcher to a firm of solicitors. The discovery of the body in the cellar had been kept a close secret, and no word of the findings had appeared in the press. Dobkin was put under observation, and they learned he had quit his job as a fire watcher in May 1942, but was found to have visited the premises without reason a couple of months later when the local bobby spotted him enter the bombed-out building. He saw Dobkin look out of an upper window before exiting and walking away. The detectives decided to interview Harry Dobkin again at his home in Navarino Road. Caught off guard, he strenuously denied any knowledge of the murder and, clearly blustering, began telling a number of lies, which the experienced detectives only seemed to confirm his guilt. The human remains found in the Vauxhall Baptist Chapel cellar are those of your wife, they told him. "I don't know what you're talking about," Dobkin spluttered. "I don't know of any cellar at the chapel. I've never been down there. In fact, I don't believe it's my wife." Told they had a witness who had seen him enter the cellar a few weeks earlier, Dobkin claimed the man was lying. He was taken to the cellar and shown where the body was found. He still maintained his innocence. A police constable was called and confirmed that Dobkin was the man he had seen enter and knew him well from his time as a fire watcher in the previous year, as he had had cause to speak to him a number of times regarding minor breaches of the blackout. With the identity of his wife seemingly confirmed and strong circumstantial evidence linking Dobson with her disappearance and subsequent death, he was arrested and charged with willful murder. Harry Dobkin's trial took place before Mr Justice Wrottesley at the Old Bailey beginning on Tuesday the 17th of November 1942. It was to last for 5 days. Prosecution counsel Lawrence Byrne KC told the court that Dobkin had killed his wife after a dispute over maintenance payments, and there was ample evidence linking him to the scene of crime following his wife's disappearance. Defence counsel Frederick Lawton tried to suggest that the body in the cellar, despite being identified from the dental work by her dentist, was not that of Mrs Dobkin. Lawton got the pathologist to agree that if the missing woman was 5'3" tall, then it could not be her remains that had been discovered buried in the cellar. He produced a missing person notice made at the time of Rachel Dobkin's disappearance, which described her as being 5'3" tall. It had been determined by Dr. Simpson's evidence that the remains in the cellar were approximately 5'1". If this latter figure was correct, the skeleton could not be Rachel Dobkin, and Simpson had no choice but to admit as much. The missing person report had been given by Rachel's sister, and when she was called to the stand, she said that her sister's height had been misinterpreted. She said that when the report was made and she was asked for her sister's height, Polly Dubinsky told the person making note that Rachel was the same height as her. He had then, without measuring, just noted down 5'3". The whole case now rested on this piece of evidence. Polly Dubinsky was taken to an anteroom and the court waited while her height was checked. A short time later, it was recorded at just under 5 foot tall, not 5'3", as the defence had claimed. Harry Dobkin had appeared smug and confident both in the dock at the remand and at his trial, but after Simpson had gave his evidence, it was noted his face turned ashen and he began to sweat profusely. Following the clarification of the missing woman's height, the jury retired to consider their verdict on the 5th day of the trial. At 12:15, they left the dock to return just 20 minutes later, having found Dobkin guilty as charged. He was taken to the condemned cell at Wandsworth. The gallows at the South London prison had been busy with 2 executions in the week before Dobkin's trial, and with 2 enemy agents scheduled to go to the gallows before Dobkin. An appeal was launched which brought into question Dobkin's mental state, but it was quickly rejected, with the appeal judges claiming it was a brutal murder, there was no flaw in the trial or the judges summing up, and the sentence was just. Prior to his execution, Harry Dobkin would confess that he had killed his wife, as she had repeatedly pestered him for money, and he wanted to be rid of her. At 9 o'clock on Wednesday the 27th of January 1943, Harry Dobkin was hanged at Wandsworth by Albert Pierpoint and Herbert Morris. It was said by those present at the execution that he met his death bravely, praying ardently as he was led to the drop. As the law dictated, his body was left to hang for 1 hour. Keith Simpson, whose evidence had led Dobkin to his fate, carried out the post-mortem that death had been due to a fracture of the spine between the 2nd and 3rd vertebra with a transverse tear of the spinal cord. Also broken was a tiny bone to the side of the thyroid cartilage that had caused the death of Rachel Dobkin. Harry Dobkin's body was brought from the scaffold dressed in a vest, trousers and socks but minus shoes, and Simpson's secretary, Polly Lefebvre, noted in her biography that he had the deep red mark of the noose around his neck, but other than that, after the ordeal of his trial and the wait for his execution, he now looked at peace. Although he would go on to have a longer distinguished career, rising to professor, Cedric Keith Simpson later rued that the case had happened during the war, when due to paper shortages, the newspapers were much thinner than normal and dominated by coverage of the war. Polly Lefebvre in her biography had called it a case of a lifetime, and although there are similarities to the Dr. Crippen case, with human remains being dug up, which had launched the career of Bernard Spilsbury, due to little coverage in the media, Simpson never got the accolades or recognition his skills in solving this case had deserved. Nobody will ever know how many murders were carried out during the war that went undetected. What is known that if Dobkin had put her dismembered remains under the stone in quicklime and not slate lime, or had not used any chemicals, it is quite possible that the insects and natural decomposition would have destroyed the evidence that Dr. Simpson had found that led to his downfall. In 1953, British film company Anglo Amalgamated launched the Scotland Yard series. The films, each roughly 30 minutes long, had been made to be shown in cinemas as a support feature to the main film. The first episode in the series is entitled The Drayton Case. Narrated by Edgar Lustgarten, it begins with him asking, "Have you ever murdered anyone?" before going on to mention the difficulty in disposing of a body. Although the films were all meant to be based on true cases from the Scotland Yard records, it was only this episode that was clearly a reconstruction of an actual historical case. Victor Platt and Hilda Berry play Harry and Rachel Dobkin, and although there are changes of location as well as their names, there is no mistaking that this is a story of Harry Dobkin, who murdered his wife in a bombed-out London cellar during the Blitz. My name is Steve Fielding. Thank you for listening to and watching another episode of Tales from the Hangman's Record. If you have enjoyed this presentation, please press like, and if you don't already, can I ask you to take a few seconds to subscribe. There is no cost, it just helps keep the channel on the air and informs you when new content is published. Check out my website stevefielding.com, where you can find information on all my previous and current books, and also order copies of the 3-volume Hangman's Record 1868 to 1964 trilogy at a special discounted price. My latest book, Tales from the Hangman's Record Volume 1, is now available from Amazon as a paperback and Kindle download. And look out for my 2 podcast channels, Tales from the Hangman's Record and Mostly Murder, which will feature cases that do not come under the scope of the Hangman's Record series. Do you think the verdict in this case was correct? Use your comments below for your thoughts on this episode and also for suggestions for further cases to be featured in the Tales from the Hangman's Record series.